Whiteley's garden. So there you go. Anyway, I'm supposed to be talking about, yes, autism and anxiety, nothing like that. He did send me a photo as well, bizarrely. Anyway. So I just wanted to follow on, and I don't suppose you're all the same people who was here for Lynn's talk, which is a bit weird. It's really annoying following on for somebody who's really good. If you follow on from somebody who's really bad, it's a no-win situation, because you just go, oh, I really disagree with everything they've said, and that makes them feel bad. Or you follow on for someone who's really good, you just want to stand there and go, well, yeah, I disagree with her, that's it.
But not that bad, Luke.
But Lynn mentioned masking, and when you do follow on from somebody who's really good, oh yeah, I want to say this, I want to say that, and I want to say the other, and then you don't get around to talking about what you're supposed to be talking about. But I did just want to mention masking, because it's so important, not in terms of, this is a talk about masking, well, I think I might mention it later on, but masking in terms of introducing you to Wittgenstein's line. So I don't know if you know Wittgenstein's line. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, a philosopher back in the day, who was clearly autistic, I don't know, well, he's not officially, like, I suppose you're not supposed to sort of retrospectively diagnose him. If you've read his work, it's like so obvious. Anyway, Wittgenstein came up with his concept of the Wittgenstein line. So, and I'm sure you'll be aware of the line, but say line is here today, comes in and starts having a chat. And Wittgenstein's line can speak English. So Wittgenstein will have a chat with you, or with me, or whoever, and we'll have this chat in English, and we're using the same words. Wittgenstein's philosophy, or his what his suggestion was, that we will not understand each other. So we're talking the same language, but we won't have an understanding, because our framework, our life view, our experience, everything is so, our frame of references, our frames of reference, I should say, are so completely oblique, so completely disparate from one another, that even though we're using the same words, we won't have we won't have a common understanding. And Lynn mentioned the word masking, and whenever somebody mentions masking and autistic masking, and this does tie in with autistic anxiety, I'm reminded of Wittgenstein's line, and I think it's incredibly important to understand that even though we might be using the same words in our language, in the English language, to refer to a phenomenon, in this case, masking, it might actually mean something quite qualitatively different to the autistic individual compared to the predominant neurotype. So that's the term I use for non-autistic populations, and I can explain why if you're particularly interested. If not, you can read my thesis. Don't do that. Page 185. Anyway, but so going back to masking, so often, so you talk about masking and echopraxic behaviour and copying, and in fact, Lynn gave a really nice example of masking from a young woman. And so often within schools, educators, I don't want to be slagging off educators or schools, and I don't know most of you anyway, so you can't complain, because if I'm complaining about people, it can't be you, because I don't know you. So I've excused myself already. And there's some amazing practice that goes on out there. But so often, people, very well-meaning, say, yeah, but we all mask a bit. Yeah? It's like, well, we all do that a bit, and I just think, and I think there's a huge difference between behaving in a slightly different way to fit in with a situation and autistic masking. I love things in sets of three. So I always come back with 3 questions. So when you're masking, rhetorically speaking, are you A, consciously aware that you're doing it all the time? Secondly, does it take an enormous amount of energy? And thirdly, as a direct result of that, do you need time to recover? By which I literally, not even figuratively, mean you need to go and lie down for a day or 2 days or a week or a month. And I suppose a corresponding question, going back to again what Lynn was talking about earlier, does ongoing masking lead to trauma and burnout? And if the answer to those 3 questions are no, which invariably they are, you can go back and say, actually, this is Wittgenstein's line. Your type of masking is not the same as a lived autistic experience. And I would say the same about anxiety. Anxiety is not the sole domain of autistic people, obviously. Is there such a thing as autistic anxiety compared to non-autistic anxiety in a general sense? My argument would be yes. The intensity, the duration, in fact, I think I've even got a slide on it, seeing as I am actually supposed to be doing a presentation. That's my position. That's just so you're not allowed to complain about me, so don't worry about that. This is the really depressing bit, and it is depressing. I work right across the age range. Far too many adults are living with trauma. And far too many of those adults who are living with trauma say themselves that the trauma is a direct result of being a child. And of those, a lot of the trauma has been just living as a child going to a mainstream school without adaptations. And we can do so much about it. And by trauma, I mean trauma. So I worked with, I think he's still the youngest person ever. This is a horrible story with a really happy ending, by the way, so don't be too worried about it. But he was the youngest person ever at the age of 7 to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was just as a direct result of him going to a primary school. And he was so traumatised just by the ordinary everyday activity that goes on in a primary school. We can overshare, can't we? I was traumatised at school because my parents didn't have very much money. We couldn't afford school meals, so I had packed lunch. And I was 6. So very, very, very early on in my school career. And I went into the canteen, and so far that term, which very first, actually I was going to really overshare. Oh, you're all kind, aren't you? The very first day I went to school, I stabbed somebody. Anyway, I hadn't been long going to lunch, and I went to lunch, and I went to sit down, and a dinner lady said, "You're not allowed to sit there." And I never went back to that school. And I'm still traumatised to this day, because I was so terrified throughout the rest of the day, and then thinking, I don't know where I'm supposed to be. I know I'm not allowed there, but that doesn't give me any indication as to where I'm supposed to be. And I just refused to go back to school. And in the end, my parents said, "Okay, you don't have to go back to that school. We'll find somewhere else." And that one flippant, tiny little, and I still have trauma dreams about it, and I'm 53. So never underestimate the impact that you, in terms of education, or people, or parents, or whatever, can have on a child. And this young man was so traumatised. I mean, he's at university now, he's got a scholarship, he's doing incredibly well, once we'd got him into the right school. But I think we're literally failing, I can look at this, we're literally failing autistic people on a day-to-day basis. Not everybody, and as I say, there's some really, really good practice out there. There's so much we can do to change. At the moment, the very model of autism that we have, and the very bedrock upon which we understand autism, and I say understand very much in inverted commas, as a society, is, I was going to say completely wrong, I ought to be polite and say flawed. I'm not allowed to swear too much, am I? It's very, very, very wrong. So we've got the medical model of autism. So in order to be, just in terms of traumatising autistic people, and actually pointing parents down the incorrect pathway right from the outset, you have schools, for example, saying, "Oh, we'd like you to come in because we've got concerns about your child." So you're concerned that my child's autistic, or your child's behaviour is raising red flags, and there's an indication of autism. Red flags means danger. So you're automatically positioning that child in a negative light, right from the outset, and almost all of the autism narrative paints autistic people in a negative light. And if you don't believe me, and you want a really depressing Friday evening, go and read DSM. Because it states your child, or you, if you're an autistic adult, essentially needs to be a lesser human being in order for us to rubber stamp you as, in fact, we're not even going to rubber stamp you as autistic, we're going to rubber stamp you as disordered. There's no such thing as being autistic. According to the DSM and the ICD, you have to have an autistic spectrum disorder. So in order to qualify to be part of this amazing tribe, you have to be a disordered human being. What does that say to you? What does that say about your child? What does that say to you as a child? I put out a tweet a couple of years ago saying, and I'd just gone around a tour of schools during Autism Awareness Week, and all these schools are raising awareness of autism, which I hate. It's like, why do we need to be aware of autism? There are people all around us. Anyway, and every single school had posters up, and every single poster was a picture of a rainbow saying autistic spectrum disorder. And I was like, this is deemed as good practice. You're just demonstrating to every autistic child who can read and reads that they're disordered. And this is during a week where we're supposed to be encouraging and celebrating autism and neurodiversity. And you just think that rhetoric is so horrific. It's so ableist. You'll know about ableism. You'll know probably about ethnocentricity, so ethnocentricity being a cultural phenomenon where one culture believes inherently that they're better in some way. And then you've got the neuronormativity paradigm, which is essentially ethnocentricity for being neurodivergent. So essentially saying there is a right cognitive way of doing things or being, and if you fall outside of that in terms of being neurodivergent, then you're somehow lesser. And if you don't believe me, read the very first line I ever wrote in an autism book, which I still maintain is the best line I've ever written. And I believe it's word for word, it says, never believe anything you read about autism, which is a really good start for a book about autism. But I meant it in terms of there's so much rhetoric that's wrong and that needs challenging in order to alleviate the risk of these individuals ending up being traumatised adults or traumatised children as well. If you're told on a day-to-day basis that you are disordered, impaired, deficient in some way, not good enough, then that encourages masking, which we know now, due to good research, that masking does lead to trauma as an adult. Because essentially you're being told you're not good enough, you've got to conform, you've got to fit in, your way of doing things is not good enough, you need to sit still, you need to stop saying those things. Tigger, who got a mention, honorary mention earlier, I'm going to embarrass myself, just showed me a picture of his dog. And it reminds me, and apologies for those of you who've heard it before, the very first time I ever spoke in public, I was really scared. I was thinking, oh God, what if somebody asks me a question that I can't answer? And I thought, right, okay, well, it was 7 till 9. I thought, right, okay, I'll just turn up at 7 o'clock, talk at the audience for 2 hours, and then run away. And I won't invite the audience to ask questions or anything. Anyway, sorry to pick on you, but you're sort of the right sort of, this elderly lady, I'm not saying you're elderly, by the way. Some fictitious knowledge. Anyway, somebody at the front put her hand up, and I was like, she sat right at the front, so everybody could see her waving her hand. It's like, you could have at least sat at the back, and then I could have ignored you. Anyway, she said, and this is word for word, I was like, oh yeah, you've got a question. Actually, the first thing that happened was somebody fell asleep and started snoring. I was like, oh God, that doesn't do your confidence any good whatsoever. His mum introduced me to him after, so it's my autistic son, I'm so sorry he fell asleep, and he just went, Mum, why are you saying sorry to that man? I was tired and he was boring. Anyway, this woman at the front, I was like, oh yeah, what do you want to, and she said, what about cats? I'm like, what? It's like, you know, cats. I'm like, you know what cats are? And they said, are they any good for autistic people? I was like, oh, guys, I'm worse. No, I was like, I wanted to pretend. I was like, oh, could I get away with this? You know, the latest research on feline activity. And I just had to, I have no idea what you're talking about. Anyway, and this again is a horrible story, but ties in absolutely with the concept of trauma and anxiety. And she's married. She'd been married about 30 years, and they didn't have any kids. She absolutely adores her husband, and she knows her husband absolutely adores her. So her husband's autistic, she's not. But she often felt quite lonely, she was telling me, because her husband didn't really talk to her at a sort of emotional level. It was very much, you know, what time are you home from work or whatever. And she was, after about 20 years of marriage, she was driving home and she stopped at some traffic lights. She was looking around the way that you do. And she saw a pet shop that was selling kittens. She thought, I'm going to get myself a kitten so I feel less lonely. Got this kitten, took it home. As soon as she got the kitten home, her husband started talking to the cat. And this is word for word as well. She said, I sat there and I listened. And I learned more about my husband in 3 days than I had done in the previous 20 years. And it blew me away. And then she said, she had an epiphany. She said, I waited till my husband was in the room and the cat was in the room. I started talking to the cat as well. And she said, now, for the last 10 years, we've just been communicating via the cat. And she said, I came to your talk and I thought I'd ask you the question if this is quite normal. And I think it is. I did get quite anxious. I thought, well, the cat dies. She said, we just got another one. So that was okay. But when I got to know the husband, and I wanted to know why he wouldn't talk to his wife, but he would talk to the cat. And he explained that as a child, he was inquisitive, he was curious, as autistic kids usually are, but he learned very quickly that the stress of opening his mouth and saying anything that wasn't just very basic was too much. So he just gave up. He said, asking questions that I thought were good questions and being told that's a stupid question. Or making some comment saying, oh, I don't think that's right, to be told, of course it's right, that's ridiculous, you're silly, you're stupid, you shouldn't have said that, da, da, da. Negative, negative, negative. And the unknown of when you open your mouth in terms of what that response is going to be. Never underestimate how stressful that is. If I was to do an experiment with you now, in terms of, okay, here's another one that really can cause so much. You could save an autistic child's life, literally, by the way, and we know that one of the biggest killers of autistic adults who die way too early than they should is by suicide. We know that, and a lot of that is down to trauma as a child. One of the things, and this doesn't often get talked about, but really interested, I'm trying not to look at it in case you go, what is he on about? But one of the things that so many of our autistic children hate, and adults as well, is being put on the spot, being put under the limelight, being told to come to the front of the class, or whatever it might be. If I was, and being asked a question in front of other people with an expectation that you've got an answer. I sometimes use this as a real life example. I'll come back to that in a moment. This is a real life example. The very first day of primary school, and a young lady, young girl, autistic young girl, lining up to go into school for the very first time. There's a lovely head teacher, and the head teacher is greeting every single one of the newcomers. And every single one of them, she's saying, oh, good morning, how are you feeling today? And it got to her, and it was the same question, how are you feeling? And she's just absolutely struck dumb. So she's in a position where somebody's asking her an impossible question. She doesn't know how she's feeling. She's alexithymic. She doesn't understand feelings at that tender young age. Most kids don't, but most kids are able to go fine, good, whatever. She genuinely doesn't know how to answer, and yet she knows she's got to give an answer. So if I do an experiment, I won't tell you how many people I'll choose out of the audience. If I was to say, right, nosologically speaking, subterm glyphic is my favourite isogram. So I'll choose some people out of the audience to stand up, maybe come up on the stage and articulate to the rest of the audience what their favourite is. I'm not going to. But, I mean, you're more than welcome if you want to. But if I was to do that, if I was literally to approach you, say, right, here's the microphone, how would that, rhetorical question, how would that make you feel in terms of anxiety? Probably you wouldn't like it. Some of you might be like, no, I'm going to leave. But actually that can cause so much stress. I think every single time you open your mouth to an autistic person, there's a risk of that happening, in terms of that expectation of response. It's one of the reasons why email or verbal and non-verbal, as in non-face-to-face communication, is so much better. If you get asked a question via email, I just had a thought the other day, but in fact it was a while ago, I think I put it in one of my books, but if I didn't, you can steal this. I promise you, you can steal this bit of practice, you can implement it, and you can get a Nobel Prize, okay? Mm-hmm. Why don't we, and you can do this for free, and I can't guarantee it, but I can almost guarantee it would revolutionise at least the lives of some neurodivergent individuals. In school, and let people bring their devices to school. They're not the devil's devices that the society believe that they are. I have no idea why everyone, screen time, it's really not a problem. Anyway, there's no evidence to suggest there's a problem anyway. Let people bring their iPads in, or laptops, or whatever. If kids don't have them, provide them for yourselves. And just have a Zoom link for every single class that you teach. As simple as that. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't have to be a Zoom link. It can be whatever. Have a link and allow children to wear headphones. I'm obsessed with sensory stuff. And Lynn's already mentioned the sensory side of things for the PDA kids, same for autistic kids. If you're in a classroom and you can pick up every single noise, which means you can't actually process what the teacher is saying, you haven't got a chance. All of a sudden, you've got a computer program, you've got your earphones on, drowns out everything else, you're only focused on the teacher's voice. You can record it, so you can process it as many times as you like at a later date. And it also means you can ask the teacher a question. And if you don't want to ask the question in the main chat because you don't want to be seen by anybody else, you can direct message the teacher. All of a sudden you've got open communication in an educational environment where hitherto before that, you couldn't understand what was being said because of the sensory distraction. Secondly, you weren't able to ask a question because you were too terrified to put your hand up in front of the rest of the class. And thirdly, you've got a recording so you can process as many times as you want at a later date. That can literally mean the difference between a child leaving school with no qualifications and a child going to university, I think. So you can pretend that's your idea, because it's a brilliant idea. And it doesn't cost anything, nothing whatsoever. And I genuinely think, if we flood the normal with the not normal, then all of a sudden the not normal becomes Amazon packages, right? Bear with me. Before COVID, if anybody can remember that far back, you'd be absolutely shocked if your Amazon delivery appeared without you being harassed or gotten out of bed or being told to sign for it or have a photo taken next to it. All of a sudden, overnight, that practice completely changed. Completely. And now it's completely normalised for you to just turn up, oh, a pile of Amazon packages. Somebody just chucked at the front door. Completely changed. Absolutely. And that's ridiculous, in a sense, ridiculous example. But if we can change awesome practice overnight like that by doing these sorts of things, why shouldn't we be doing it? And I really ought to do this fucking presentation. Okay, right. For all you know, there's only 3 slides. Okay, so yes, I mentioned that being anxious is not the sole domain of autistics. I argue it's useful at the very least to understand autistic anxiety as a real concept. So in the same way that English is still the same language, but I think it's worth understanding autistic language as a conceptually different thing, similarly with anxiety. And I've just mentioned those 3, duration, elevation and rumination. Now for you, not you, I don't know who you are, most of you, but for the predominant neurotype, anxiety patterns are quite similar from one person to the next. And the pattern in terms of, if we had a graph I could show you, but so say for example you're going to something that causes you anxiety, you've got an event, an anxiety-inducing event, whatever that might be. So you can think to yourself, so I'll give the example of an interview, job interview, because that's such a common one that people get anxious about. Say for example you're checking your emails now because you're bored of listening to me, and you get an email going, oh yeah, congratulations, you're through to the next stage of your job, and you've got an interview in 3 weeks' time. Okay, at 3 o'clock, I told you I think it's in 3 weeks. Anyway, so you might get a bit of a jolt of adrenaline now while you're reading that email. Stop checking your emails, by the way. And you might get a jolt of adrenaline, a bit of a buzz, a bit of anxiety, but actually your level of anxiety will be pretty static over the next 2 weeks. The last week leading up to that, it will get slightly higher, slightly higher, slightly higher. On the evening before and the day that you wake up, when you wake up on that Friday, 3 weeks today, and congratulations to getting to the next stage, by the way, well done. But you wake up and you know you're anxious. You actually wake up thinking, okay, I feel differently today. As it gets closer and closer, you might not even eat lunch because you're too stressed. As it gets closer and closer to 3 o'clock, that level of anxiety, the curve of anxiety gets much, much steeper. And at 10 to 3, 5 to 3, and around 3 o'clock, between 3 o'clock and usually about 10 past 3, it's at its peak. And then it starts coming down. What amazes me about you lot, again, generalisation, but often, when you walk out of that interview, your anxiety levels drop. They dissipate, they almost disappear incredibly quickly. You have no idea how lucky you are. And it's like a skill, I think. It's like a superpower in a sense. Because it literally is like, oh, I'm so relieved, and then you go to the pub. When you go to the pub, here's something else, by the way, not related to anxiety as such, but when you go to the pub and you're thinking about that interview, quite often you'll think, why didn't I give that answer to that question? I've just thought of the best answer, I gave a rubbish answer, why didn't I say? What you've demonstrated in that instance, and you'll have all been in that situation, and some of you, not many, I don't know, but some of you have been in that situation after you've had a big argument with your partner, and then you go down the pub with her, why didn't I say that to him? That would have really taken him back down. Both those scenarios demonstrate you've got the intellectual reasoning to think of exactly the right thing to say, but you've also demonstrated that at that time you didn't have the cognitive ability to say it, because there's a direct correlation between cognitive ability and emotional arousal levels, in this case anxiety. So basically, putting it much more simply, the more anxious you are, the less able you are to think, which is why reduction of anxiety is so important. That's why I don't understand why it's not part of teaching. Well, it is part of teaching, but we should be recognised. The very first thing you should do as a teacher is make sure that your students, your pupils, are as safe as possible. It goes back to what Lynn was saying, anxiety-free as possible, because that is literally part of the process of teaching. If you don't do that to start off with, you've got no chance. So going back to the levels of anxiety, you take then an autistic person and give them an anxiety-inducing activity, for example, a birthday party. Oh, you're going to a birthday party in 3 weeks. So straight away your anxiety is at a similar level as it will be in 3 weeks' time, because you're so worried about it. And that takes 3 weeks. And then your peak is often higher, and then you've got another 3 weeks afterwards where we talk about the social hangover, the rumination period that I talk about here, where you've got 3 weeks of going over and over and over, what did I get wrong, what could I have done better, why did that happen, etc. So all of a sudden, rather than one day being anxious, you've got 6 weeks. And what other people see is, oh, you're just anxious on that day, because you're not necessarily displaying it. So I think there's definitely qualitatively, and by the way, I just randomly made up that number of weeks. I know people who are anxious years after a particular event in terms of the trauma that it's caused them, and they literally can't compute it, can't process it. Oh yes, I look like I've copied this off Lynn, but I wrote it first. 2017, page 11. Autism as environment equals time. So I've actually expanded on what environment actually is. And there's some amazing work being done by Mary Doherty and her colleagues over in Ireland with autistic space and what environment means in terms of space. So I think you can amalgamate those. So she's part of the Autistic Doctors Network, ADN. I love that, I'll just read it out because I love the quotation so much. Trying to squash an autistic peg into a PNT-shaped environment, A, won't ever work, B, really hurts, and C, wrecks both the autistic peg and the PNT-shaped environment. And as an analogy, I think it works. There is literally no point. You are not going... By the way, that equation, it just drives me... It doesn't drive me, it upsets me so much that so invariably, and Lynn did an amazing job. For those of you who didn't know Lynn, tough shit. But you'll have to catch up with her another time. But amazing job saying, look, none of what she was saying was trying to change the child. It was all about changing the environment. Far too often it's, you need to change, you need to conform, you need to adapt. No, they don't. If you accept that you can't change somebody being autistic, which you can't, you've got to accept that, I'm telling you. It's one of the few things we can all agree on. You can't stop that. Yeah, unless you're completely... No, I'm not going to say that. Anyway, you're wrong if you start out, you think you can cure autism. I didn't know of a cure, actually. I was working in residential services. A guy came downstairs one morning in his early 30s. I'm not autistic anymore. I was like, oh gosh, that's amazing. And I just turned out he'd lost his virginity. And he's like, clearly still autistic, he just didn't care. But I do remember thinking at the time, if that was true, what would you do with that information? It's kind of like the latest research article in the Lancet. Can I get shut? Anyway. Where was I? Oh yeah, so if we accept you can't change somebody being autistic, and you can't make anybody less autistic either. Just quickly, I know I'm supposed to be talking about anxiety, but I can't. So, autism is not behaviour. We can also, and sometimes I get people go, oh no, you can't say that, well, everybody talks about autistic behaviour. I can very, very confidently stand in front of however many people you are here, I haven't counted, and categorically state, and I don't say things I don't have belief in, because I'm in such fear of being found out that I'm wrong. So actually, why are we listening to you? So I think I'm right, but only because I can justify what it is I'm saying. So if you meet me afterwards and you say, oh, when you said that, justify it, I will be able to. I might still be wrong, but at least I'll have faith that I'm right. I can categorically say there's no such thing as autistic behaviour. So in a sense, there's very little point in talking about autistic behaviour. Or if we change that person's behaviour, we're somehow changing their being autistic. And the reason I can quite comfortably say there's no such thing as autistic behaviour, or set of behaviours that is unique to being autistic, is if there were, then the diagnostic waiting lists would disappear overnight. Because we'd immediately be able to say, do you behave like that? Yes or no. If yes, you're autistic. If no, then you're not. And we can't do that. So unless you don't believe what I've just said, we can categorically say there is no such thing as autistic behaviour. However, some people will say certain characteristics that are often associated with being autistic, and often they're anxiety-led. So say, for example, stimming. If you're stimming because you're anxious, and then this is so unbelievably wrong, and yet you see it. Lynn will tell you, people will tell you this time, and they will witness this time and time again in schools, or there's a sign of anxiety. So what we'll do is we'll stop them stimming. And you force them to stop them stimming, and by force I do mean force, and please don't ever do this. You stop them stimming, hey presto, we've stopped them being anxious. No, you haven't. they're still just as anxious, if not more. You've just cut off their voice. That's all you've done. You've stopped their expression of being anxious. You haven't stopped them being anxious in the slightest. If you forget about them stimming, work out why they're anxious in the first place, and stop that, and then they stop stimming, then you can say, well done. By the way, I've also, and I'm not having to go at anybody here that's done this, I hate it when you go into school and so-and-so goes, oh, it's a real success, and she's developed loads of coping strategies. Well, in which case you're still getting it wrong. If she has to have coping strategies, you're still getting it wrong. Don't go, way, haven't we done well because she's coping. Maybe you should have to cope. You're getting it wrong in the first place. Anyway, so autism plus environment equals outcome. So if you want to change the outcome, you can't change the autistic person. What is left is the environment. So breaking down the environment in terms of anxiety, part of the environment, so you'll see those of you who are nice and astute and numerically minded, there's 6 broken down into 3 bullet points under society, so that makes 9, which is lovely. I've just signed my book contract for my 8th book, which really annoys me because now I've got to write another 2 to make it 9. And I'm really running out of things to write about. Anyway, but part of the environment is the autistic self. And again, rhetorical question, but how much time and effort do we put into developing autistic children and adults' understanding of self? And I don't think we do. And it's fundamentally, I think, I might be wrong, I think it's fundamentally one of the biggest keys to success is understanding of your autistic self. Your own, and I love this alliterative phrase, autistic authenticity. And it's just, I mean, alliteratively it sounds nice, but it also conceptually it's just the most gorgeous concept of being allowed to be your own authentic autistic self. And how often do we actually allow that, as opposed to going, no, you can't be like that, you shouldn't be like that, you should be more like them. Again, you're a lesser human being, your way of doing things is not good enough, you've got to be more like everybody else. As opposed to, crack on, that's brilliant. Yes, we might need to adapt our school, yes, we might need to adapt what our understanding of inclusion is, yes, we might need to adapt what we think, understanding you through the autism lens. The irony of being, and I'm assuming none of you are actually Simon Baron-Cohen or married to him or anything, or a lawful representative of his. But the irony being that it's the autistic population that get accused of lacking in empathy. And yet, by the way, the BNT lack autistic empathy. I can categorically state that as well, otherwise we wouldn't be here. There'd be no such thing as an autism show. If you all had intuitive autistic empathy, you'd already know it. There'd be no point in having to learn about it. What you're doing at the moment, presumably, if I'm doing my job right and you're actually listening and taking it on board, is learning about, through the autistic lens, you're learning autistic empathy. And yet, this whole absolute nonsense about autistic people lacking empathy, which, by the way, so many autistic kids are hyper-empathizers, and that is so overwhelming at an emotional level that they close off, which then leads you lot, or not you lot again, other people to go, oh look, they're very cold or indifferent or whatever. And the opposite. I love this example. I wrote about this real life example. It's really difficult to say this without crying, but and this. So anyway, so as a mum, so it's, I quite like this is the perspective of one person. This is the perspective of another. Mum saying, I don't understand why my daughter doesn't love me. I don't understand why she won't demonstrate any kind of affection towards me. You know, I love her so much, but it's not reciprocal. And then you've got the daughter's voice saying, I don't understand why, when I walk up to mummy, and I'm this close away from her, and I put my head ever so slightly near her shoulder, why she doesn't understand I would never do that with any other human in the entire world. That's how much I love her. And you've got 2 completely different lenses around the same individual with a totally different perspective as what's going on. And I think if we don't understand the individual through their own authentic lens, we're going to misjudge those individuals over and over again. Going back to understanding your own authentic autistic self, if you don't understand who you are, the parameters against which you judge yourself, and therefore the decisions you make about yourself, are at risk of being wrong or damaging to you. And I think that's why so many autistic people make the same mistake over and over again, because they're making those decisions based on parameters that aren't actually applicable to them. They're applicable to other people whose neurotype, whose whole frame of reference, fiction times 9 again, differs to them. And this goes right across the board, even in terms of counselling. You go to counselling, and they're counselling, you're trained as a counsellor to treat, in inverted commas, non-autistic people. And if you don't adapt that to make it specific to the individual in front of you, you're highly likely to get it wrong. Anyway, so going back to environment, that can't actually be the time. Should we all just pause our watches? Oh, by the way, talking of watches, everyone knows what the time is. Everybody's got phones. Get rid of the school bell. Just literally get rid of it. School bells, from a sensory perspective, can be traumatising. Okay, here's a good one. I remember what I was supposed to be talking about. Microaggressions. So back in the 70s, so Chester Pierce, the American academic, came up with this idea of microaggressions around black Americans. So he was saying, and I think it was very clever, the way that he actually articulates, essentially saying, in everyday parlance, in everyday narrative, we are causing black Americans microaggressions on a day-to-day basis. The way in which we discuss black Americans is actually causing trauma through these individual microaggressions. Nobody would do that now, okay? You wouldn't find that in everyday comment, you'd get cancelled. And yet we do it every single day when it comes to autism. And nobody seems to be getting cancelled. I'm not saying we should go around cancelling people for saying, oh, you're disordered. But if you actually look, I've got a slide, I'll try and put it on if I've got time. But yeah, in terms of understanding of self, if you believe the rhetoric about you, then you do feel the need to conform, because you're being told day by day, you're in the wrong, you're not good enough, you need to change. Whereas if you've got that authenticity, it doesn't stop the rest of the world, but it gives you a level of armour to be able to go, no, I can make my own decision about myself, about my own well-being. Just because I was 15 when I suddenly realised my mum, who's not here, is she? That'd be weird. I was completely wrong. And so throughout my entire childhood, she'd say, Luke, you need to make friends. You haven't got enough friends. Oh, you haven't got any. I tell you, again, oversharing, but she used to be obsessed with me having friends. So she used to, this is so weird. So I have what's called prosopagnosia, face blindness, so I don't really know who people are. She used to get home and she'd go, right, go to the park at the end of the road. And so I'd go to the park, and either I'd get there early enough when no kids were there, in which case I'd just climb up a tree and hide, or other kids would be there. And I'd prepared for this, all right? And I used to spend hours in front of a mirror, not because I'm vain, but to do a mime to other kids. I used to practice this mime saying I'm deaf and dumb. And I used to go down the park and I used to mime to the other kids I was deaf and dumb. And it worked every time. They just looked at me as if I was a bit mental and walked off. So they left me alone. I was like, brilliant result. And it was only, I remember it was in my 30s, and I was thinking about this going, gosh, I was quite a strange kid. And I remembered that those kids I was miming to in the playground were the same kids I went to school with. I remember one of them, we even car shared. We used to pick him up to take and I was like, they must have thought, what is this guy doing? Anyway, so I was 15, I remember thinking, actually, Mum, you're wrong, I don't need friends. They're rubbish. They're a pain in the arse. They ask for things that you don't want to give. They expect things that you don't have, and they don't give you fuck all in return, apart from stress. And I've got a very small community of individuals who I adore. So I've got relationships, 3 to be precise, a wife and 2 sons. But generally speaking, I like other people, and I'll spend time with other people. They're not friends in the sense. Somebody asked me once, how do you know whether somebody's a friend or not? And I said, and I learned this when I was very, very young. I might be wrong. This is me talking personally, not from a professional capacity. So I may well be wrong, but this is how I do it. I go, and I still do it to this day. I go, I'll imagine what it'd be like if you were dead, and I'd work out whether I'd be bothered or not. And I think that's quite a good way of working out whether something's your friend or not. Anyway, so I've run out of time. If you just close your eyes for a sec. That's just a current example. So when I was writing this presentation, the little PowerPoint person came up and said, would you like to see Google images of autism? I was like, yes, I would, and this is the first one that came up. So inappropriate, inability, inappropriate again, oversensitive, poor, strange, puzzle, lack of awareness. So all of it, very pejorative, very negative, and some of the others were even worse. And now I've got to finish, but I wasn't intending to go through this. I have a strategy. In terms of autistic stage, I really really worry that I'm going to run out of things to say, so I always I just wanted to finish. Alicia is a woman who lives in Australia, and she contacted me once saying, "Oh, I've just read some of your stuff and I really like you, and I'm going to get on a flight from Australia and come and give you a hug." I was like, "Okay, that's nice." And then 20 minutes later, she emailed back going, yeah, it's quite a long way, and it's quite expensive, and I've realised I don't like hugging, so I'll but she writes, the privilege of being oneself is a gift. Many take for granted, but for someone with autism, being allowed to be oneself is the greatest and rarest gift of all. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. I would just leave you with that. So thank you, and have a nice night.